Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. There are places in the world where silence feels wrong, where the air itself seems to carry the weight of something unfinished. The Manila Film Center is one of those places. On certain nights, security guards refuse to patrol the lower levels alone. They say the marble floors echo with sounds that have no source, footsteps that belong to no one, voices that whisper in languages long forgotten by the living. Some claim it's just the wind passing through the structure's unusual design, but those who work there know better. They've heard the screams. They've felt the cold spots that appear without warning, even in the oppressive heat of Manila's summer nights. And they've seen the shadows, dark shapes that move beneath the polished floors as if trapped in the concrete itself, clawing toward the surface but never quite breaking through. The Manila Film Center stands along the shore of Manila Bay, a massive brutalist structure built in the early 1980s under orders from First Lady Imelda Marcos. It was meant to be the crown jewel of the Manila International Film Festival, a grand statement of the Philippines' place on the world stage. The building's design was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for the timeline imposed upon it. Construction began in January 1981, and the deadline was set for just 18 months later. For a project of that scale, it was an impossible demand. Architects warned that corners would have to be cut, that safety protocols would be compromised, but the First Lady was adamant. The festival would happen on schedule, no matter the cost. Thousands of workers were brought in, laboring in shifts around the clock. The site became a hive of constant activity, welding torches blazing through the night, concrete mixers churning without pause, scaffolding rising higher and higher above the bay. The workers were mostly poor men from the provinces, desperate for wages, willing to endure brutal conditions for the promise of payment. They slept in makeshift barracks near the site, woke before dawn, and worked until their bodies gave out. There was no time for rest, no room for error. The structure had to be completed, and it had to be magnificent, but in the rush to meet the impossible deadline, something terrible was bound to happen. The workers knew it. They felt it in the way the scaffolding swayed under too much weight, in the way supervisors barked orders without checking if the supports were secure. They felt it in the humid air, thick with the smell of wet cement and rusting metal, and in the unease that settled over the site like a fog. It happened in the early hours of November 17th, 1981, just weeks before the festival's opening. The upper floors were still under construction, and workers were pouring concrete into massive molds to form the building's foundation and structural supports. The scaffolding groaned under the weight of the wet cement, and several workers voiced concerns to their supervisors. They were ignored. Production could not stop. Then, without warning, a section of scaffolding gave way. The sound was deafening, a metallic shriek followed by the thunder of collapsing steel and wood. Workers screamed as they fell, tumbling into the open molds where liquid concrete was being poured. Some tried to grab onto the scaffolding as it came down, but the weight was too much. Others were crushed instantly by falling beams. Within seconds, dozens of men were submerged in the thick, gray mixture, their arms flailing, their mouths open in silent screams as the cement filled their lungs. Those who survived the initial collapse scrambled to help, reaching into the molds to pull their co-workers free. But the concrete was already hardening. Hands that broke the surface were yanked, but the bodies beneath were stuck fast. Panic spread through the site as more workers rushed to the scene, digging with bare hands, trying to scoop away the cement before it set completely. But it was already too late for most of them. The concrete had begun its chemical reaction, generating heat as it solidified, and the men trapped inside could feel it hardening around their bodies, locking them in place. Some were buried up to their waists, others up to their necks. A few were completely submerged, visible only as vague shapes beneath the surface. The site foreman radioed for emergency services, but when officials arrived, they were met with a decision that would haunt the project forever. Imelda Marcos herself was informed of the incident, and according to several accounts, the order came down swiftly. The bodies were not to be removed. Excavating them would delay construction by weeks, possibly months, and the festival could not be postponed. The concrete was to be poured over them, and the work was to continue. Some engineers protested, horrified by the command, but they were overruled. Guards were stationed around the site to prevent workers from speaking to the press, and families of the missing men were allegedly paid off or threatened into silence. By the next morning, fresh concrete had been poured over the molds, sealing the bodies inside. The official death toll was reported as somewhere between 3 and 7 workers, but those who were there insist the real number was much higher. Some say it was over 100. Others claim it was closer to 300. No accurate count was ever made, because no bodies were ever officially recovered. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen at the construction site. Workers reported hearing muffled cries, coming from the newly poured floors, as if voices were echoing up from deep within the concrete. At first, they dismissed it as stress or exhaustion, but the sounds persisted. Some workers refused to return to the site, claiming they had seen handprints pressed against the inside of the cement, visible for just a moment before fading back into the gray surface. Others spoke of cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, even in the stifling heat of midday. The night shifts became especially difficult. Guards patrolled the perimeter with flashlights, but they reported seeing shadows moving along the walls, shadows that didn't match any living person. One guard described seeing a figure standing near the edge of the upper level, silhouetted against the moonlight. When he called out, the figure turned toward him, and he saw that its face was covered in wet cement, dripping down its chest in thick rivulets. The guard ran, and when he returned with backup, the figure was gone. The worker claimed he heard scratching sounds coming from beneath the floor, rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone were trying to claw their way out. He pressed his ear to the cold marble and swore he could hear breathing, slow and labored, coming from somewhere deep below. His supervisor told him it was just the building settling, but the worker quit the next day and never came back. Despite the growing unease, the construction continued, and the Manila Film Center was completed just in time for the festival's opening in January 1982. The event was lavish, attended by international celebrities and dignitaries, but behind the glamour, the workers who had built the place stayed silent. They knew what lay beneath the polished floors, and they knew that the building would never truly be at peace. After the festival ended, the film center fell into disuse. It hosted a few events over the years, but it never became the cultural landmark Imelda Marcos had envisioned. The building's reputation had been tainted by the rumors, and people were reluctant to spend time inside its walls. Guards who worked the night shift began to refuse assignments there, citing the oppressive atmosphere and the strange occurrences that seemed to intensify after dark. One guard named Carlos took a shift in 1985, needing the extra pay despite the stories he'd heard. He was stationed in the main lobby, tasked with monitoring the entrance and making periodic rounds through the building's lower levels. For the first few hours, everything was quiet. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic outside and the occasional creak of the building settling. But around midnight, Carlos began to hear something else. It started as a faint tapping, like fingernails on glass, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. He checked the windows, thinking it might be a branch or debris, but they were all intact and clear. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. Carlos grabbed his flashlight and moved toward the sound, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The tapping led him to a stairwell that descended into the lower levels, areas that were rarely used and poorly lit. He hesitated at the top of the stairs, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness below. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic breathing. Carlos called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. He took a step down, then another, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the walls. The air grew colder as he descended, and he could see his breath misting in front of him. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, the breathing sound was louder, coming from just around the corner. He turned, shining his light down a narrow corridor, and froze. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood motionless, its back to him. It was the shape of a man, but something about it was wrong. The proportions were off, the arms too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. Carlos called out again, his voice shaking, but the figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it began to turn. Carlos didn't wait to see its face. He ran back up the stairs, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly, and didn't stop until he reached the lobby. He radioed his supervisor, but when backup arrived and they searched the lower levels together, they found nothing. No figure, no footprints, nothing to explain what Carlos had seen. He was reassigned to a different location the next day, and he never spoke about the incident in detail again. Over the years, the stories continued to accumulate. Maintenance workers reported tools going missing, only to reappear in places they hadn't been left. Cleaning staff refused to work alone, claiming they felt watched whenever they entered certain rooms. One janitor said she had seen wet footprints appearing on the floor behind her, even though no one else was there, and the floor had been dry moments before. Another claimed she had heard a child crying in one of the unused dressing rooms, but when she opened the door, the room was empty. The most disturbing reports came from those who worked in the basement levels, where the original foundations of the building were located. Several people claimed to have seen shapes moving beneath the floor, dark silhouettes that writhed and pressed against the concrete as if trying to break through. One engineer, brought in to assess structural issues in the 1990s, took photographs of the basement for his report. When the photos were developed, several of them showed strange, face-like patterns in the concrete, features that seemed almost human but distorted, as if frozen in expressions of agony. The engineer submitted his report but refused to return to the site. He told his colleagues that the building felt alive, that it breathed and shifted in ways that had nothing to do with normal settling or temperature changes. He said he could feel the weight of all those lives pressing up from below, still struggling, still searching for a way out. The Manila Film Center remains standing today, though it's largely abandoned. The government has considered demolishing it several times, but each proposal has stalled, plagued by budget issues, legal disputes, or unexplained delays. Some believe the building doesn't want to be torn down, that the spirits trapped inside would rather remain entombed than face whatever comes next. Others think the structure itself has become a kind of memorial, a silent testament to the workers who died there, their names never recorded, their families never given closure. On certain nights, locals report seeing lights flickering inside the building, even though the power has been cut for years. They see shadows moving across the windows, shapes that pause as if looking out at the city beyond. And they hear the sounds, faint but unmistakable, drifting across the bay on the wind. Screams, muffled and distant, coming from somewhere deep within the concrete. The workers are still there, trapped in the foundation, and they have never stopped trying to make themselves heard. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it's far from the only one. Across Asia, there are countless places where the past refuses to stay buried, where history has left scars that still bleed into the present. In Myanmar, along the Irrawaddy River, there stands a pagoda so beautiful it seems to glow under the moonlight. But beauty can be deceiving, and the white terraces of Sinbiume Pagoda hide a sorrow that has never faded. Pilgrims who visit after dark speak of a woman who walks those spirals, her footsteps silent, her presence unmistakable. They say she's searching for something she lost long ago, something she can never reclaim. And those who encounter her are left with a chill that no fire can warm. The Sinbiume Pagoda rises from the dusty plains near Mingun, a small town upriver from Mandalay. Built in 1816 by King Bagadaw in memory of his beloved wife, Queen Shinbiuma, the structure is unlike any other in Myanmar. Its 7 terraces are meant to represent the 7 mountain ranges that surround Mount Meru in Buddhist cosmology, each level cascading downward in elegant, undulating waves. The entire pagoda is painted white, so bright it's almost blinding in the midday sun, and the design gives the impression of something ethereal, something not quite of this world. Visitors often describe it as breathtaking, a place of profound beauty and serenity. But those who know its history understand that beneath that beauty lies a tragedy that has never been laid to rest. Queen Shinbiume was only 21 years old when she died, her life cut short by complications during childbirth. She had been King Bagidaw's favorite wife, renowned for her grace and kindness, and her death devastated him. The king ordered the pagoda built immediately, pouring his grief into its construction, determined to create something that would honor her memory for centuries to come. But grief is a heavy thing, and sometimes it refuses to dissipate, clinging to the places where it was born. The first reports of strange occurrences at the pagoda began within years of its completion. Local monks who tended the site spoke of seeing a woman in white walking the terraces late at night, her figure glowing faintly in the moonlight. At first, they assumed she was a pilgrim who had stayed too late, but when they approached her, she would vanish, leaving behind only the scent of jasmine, the queen's favorite flower. The monks began to avoid the pagoda after dark, and they warned villagers to do the same. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and some couldn't resist the temptation to see the apparition for themselves. A young man named Ong visited the pagoda one evening in the late 1800s, determined to prove the stories were nothing more than superstition. He climbed the terraces as the sun set, the white stone turning gold in the fading light, and waited. For a while, nothing happened. The air was still, the only sound the distant call of birds settling into the trees. But as the moon rose, Ong felt a change. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the scent of jasmine filled the air, so strong it was almost overwhelming. He stood, looking around, and saw her. She was standing on the terrace above him, her back turned, her white robes flowing despite the absence of wind. Her hair was long and dark, cascading down her back, and she seemed to be looking out toward the river. Ong called out, his voice echoing across the stone, but she didn't respond. He took a step closer, his heart pounding, and as he did, she began to turn. He caught a glimpse of her face, pale and beautiful, her eyes dark and filled with an unbearable sadness. Then she was gone, dissolved into the moonlight as if she had never been there at all. Ong left the pagoda and never returned. He told his friends what he had seen, but most dismissed it as a trick of the light or an overactive imagination. Yet the stories persisted, and over the decades, more and more people reported similar encounters. By the mid-20th century, the legend of the woman in white had become a well-known part of local folklore. Tourists began visiting the pagoda specifically hoping to see her, and some claimed they had. A British traveler in the 1930s wrote in his journal about an evening he spent at Biume, describing a woman who appeared on the upper terrace and seemed to be weeping. He noted that his camera, which had been working perfectly all day, suddenly stopped functioning when he tried to photograph her. The film jammed, and when he finally got it working again, the woman was gone. He developed the photos later and found that several frames were completely black, even though they had been taken in full moonlight. Another account came from a Burmese family who visited the pagoda in the 1960s. They had brought their young daughter with them, and as they climbed the terraces, the girl suddenly stopped and pointed toward the central stupa. She told her parents she could see a sad lady standing there, a lady who wanted to go home but couldn't. The parents saw nothing, but their daughter insisted, describing the woman's white robes and long dark hair in detail. The family left quickly, unsettled by the girl's certainty. These encounters were never aggressive or threatening. The woman in white didn't chase anyone, didn't try to harm or frighten. She simply appeared, her presence marked by the scent of jasmine and the sudden drop in temperature. And then she was gone. But her sadness was palpable, a grief so deep it seemed to saturate the air itself. In the 1980s, a group of university students from Mandalay decided to investigate the legend. They arrived at the pagoda late one evening, armed with flashlights and a tape recorder, determined to document any paranormal activity. They set up their equipment on the middle terrace and waited, chatting and joking to keep their nerves at bay. As midnight approached, the laughter stopped. One of the students, a young woman named Kin, noticed that the air had grown cold, her breath visible in the moonlight. She pointed it out to the others, and they fell silent, listening. That's when they heard it, a soft sound, almost like crying, coming from somewhere above them. The students looked up and saw her. She was standing on the highest terrace, her figure outlined against the night sky, and she was weeping. The sound was heartbreaking, a low, mournful keening that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Kin reached for the tape recorder, but as soon as she pressed the record button, the device shut off. She tried to turn it back on, but the batteries were dead, even though they had been brand new. The other students fumbled with their flashlights, but those too began to flicker and die. The woman in white turned toward them, and for a moment they saw her face clearly. It was beautiful but hollow, her eyes dark voids that seemed to look through them rather than at them. Then she raised one hand, as if reaching out, and the scent of jasmine became so strong it was almost suffocating. The students ran, stumbling down the terraces in the darkness, not stopping until they reached the road. When they looked back, the pagoda was silent and still, bathed in moonlight, as if nothing had happened. They never spoke about the incident publicly, but Kin later admitted to a close friend that she had nightmares for months afterward, dreams in which she was trapped on the terraces, unable to leave, while the woman in white stood watching, her with those hollow, sorrowful eyes. The phenomenon wasn't limited to nighttime encounters. Several people reported strange experiences during the day as well. A monk who worked at the nearby Mingun Pagoda described an incident in which he was leading a group of pilgrims through the area. As they passed Sinbiume, one of the pilgrims, an elderly woman, suddenly collapsed. When they revived her, she said she had seen a young woman in white standing among the terraces, staring directly at her. The woman's gaze had been so intense, so filled with grief, that it had overwhelmed her. The monk helped the pilgrim to a nearby shelter, but when they looked back at the pagoda, there was no one there. Another account came from a tour guide who brought foreign visitors to the site in the early 2000s. He had made the trip dozens of times without incident, but on this particular afternoon, as his group climbed the terraces, every camera in the group malfunctioned. Batteries drained. Instantly, lenses fogged over, and memory cards became corrupted. The tourists were frustrated, but the guide knew what it meant. He had heard the stories his entire life, and he had always been careful to show respect when visiting the pagoda. But on that day, something had changed. The air felt heavier, the light seemed dimmer, and he had the distinct feeling that they were not alone. He hurried the group through the visit and left as quickly as he could. Later, when the tourists checked their cameras, they found that several had captured strange anomalies in the photos, blurred shapes that resembled a human figure, always in white, always on the upper terraces. The pagoda's caretakers have grown accustomed to these reports, though they rarely speak about them openly. They understand that the structure is more than just a monument. It's a place where sorrow has crystallized, where the past remains present in ways that can't be explained or dismissed. They light candles at the base of the stupa every evening, offerings meant to bring peace to the restless spirit they believe still lingers there. They say prayers for Queen Shinbyume, hoping that one day her grief will ease and she will finally find the rest she has been denied for over 2 centuries. But the encounters continue. Pilgrims still report seeing her, still describe the scent of jasmine and the sound of weeping, still feel the inexplicable cold that settles over the terraces when she appears. And the pagoda itself seems to respond to her presence, the white stone glowing more brightly on nights when she is seen, as if the structure itself is reaching out to her, trying to offer comfort. There are those who believe Queen Shinbyume is not truly trapped, that she chooses to remain because the pagoda is the only place where she still feels connected to the life she lost. She was taken too soon, her child lost with her, and the grief of that double loss has anchored her spirit to the site. Others think she is searching for something, perhaps the child she never got to hold, or perhaps the king who built the pagoda in her honor, hoping that one day they will be reunited. Whatever the reason, her presence is undeniable, felt by monks and tourists, skeptics and believers alike. The Shinbyume Pagoda is a place of extraordinary beauty, but it is also a place of profound sadness, and those who visit it can feel the weight of that sadness pressing down on them, a reminder that some losses are too great to ever truly heal. The woman in white walks the terraces still, her footsteps silent, her sorrow eternal, and the jasmine scent lingers long after she fades into the moonlight. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. Yet even these harrowing tales are only the beginning. The darkness we've explored so far is real, rooted in places that still stand, monuments to tragedies that refuse to be forgotten. But there are other stories, ones that go even deeper into the unknown, where the line between the living and the dead becomes so blurred that it's impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. In the next part, we'll uncover something even more disturbing, a case where grief and the supernatural collide in ways that defy all rational explanation. What awaits is not just frightening. It's a glimpse into the very fabric of what haunts us and why some spirits can never truly leave. Old Changi Hospital sits on a hill in eastern Singapore, surrounded by overgrown vegetation and rusted fences that do little to keep people out. The building has been abandoned since the late 1990s, its windows shattered, its walls covered in graffiti and mold, but it still draws visitors. Urban explorers come with cameras and flashlights, hoping to capture evidence of the paranormal activity that has made the place infamous. Most leave disappointed, their footage showing nothing but empty corridors and peeling paint. But some leave with something else, a feeling they can't shake, a sense that they were not alone in those halls, that something was watching them from the shadows, waiting for them to venture just a little deeper. And a few leave with evidence they wish they had never found. Photographs that show figures where no one was standing, recordings that capture voices speaking in languages they don't understand, whispers that grow louder when played back, as if the dead are trying to make themselves heard. The hospital was built in the early 1930s to serve the British military stationed in Singapore. It was a state-of-the-art facility for its time, equipped to handle everything from routine medical care to emergency surgeries. But when the Japanese invaded Singapore in 1942, the hospital's purpose changed drastically. The occupying forces converted it into a prison and interrogation center, and the pristine medical wards became cells where prisoners were held and tortured. The building's white walls, once symbols of healing, became stained with blood and suffering. Soldiers and civilians alike were brought to Old Changi during the occupation, many of them never leaving alive. The Japanese military police used the hospital's isolation to their advantage, conducting interrogations far from prying eyes. Survivors of the occupation later testified about the horrors that took place there, describing beatings, starvation, and executions carried out with cold efficiency. Some prisoners were held in underground cells, small concrete rooms with no windows and no light, left to languish for days or weeks before being dragged out for further questioning. Others were taken to rooms on the upper floors, where the interrogations were more brutal, involving methods designed to extract information through unimaginable pain. The screams that echoed through the hospital during those years were so constant that locals living nearby began to avoid the area entirely, unable to bear the sounds of suffering that drifted down the hill on the wind. After the war ended and the Japanese surrendered, the British reclaimed the hospital and attempted to return it to its original purpose. The building was cleaned, the cells were dismantled, and efforts were made to erase the evidence of what had happened during the occupation. But the staff who worked there in the years following the war reported strange occurrences almost immediately. Nurses described hearing footsteps in empty hallways, doors that opened and closed on their own, and the faint sound of crying coming from rooms that had once been used as cells. One nurse claimed she had seen a man in tattered military uniform standing at the end of a corridor late one night, his face hollow and his eyes vacant. When she approached him to offer help, he vanished, leaving behind only a cold spot in the air where he had been standing. Doctors working the night shift reported similar experiences, shadows that moved independently of any light source, and the persistent feeling of being watched even when they were alone. The hospital's morgue, located in the basement, became particularly notorious. Staff refused to go down there alone, claiming the temperature was always unnaturally cold, and that they could hear whispers echoing off the concrete walls. One orderly said he had seen wet footprints leading from the morgue's entrance to the stairwell, even though the floor had been dry moments before and no one else was in the building. Another reported finding medical instruments scattered across the floor in patterns that seemed deliberate, as if arranged by invisible hands. The administration dismissed these reports as stress or overactive imaginations, but the incidents continued, and by the 1950s, it was common knowledge among the staff that Old Changi was haunted. The hospital remained operational until the early 1980s, when it was converted into a training facility for military personnel. Even then, the reports didn't stop. Soldiers stationed there for training exercises spoke of hearing voices in Japanese coming from the upper floors, words they couldn't understand, but that sounded urgent, almost desperate. One group of trainees was conducting a night exercise in the building, when they heard what sounded like a woman screaming from somewhere deep inside. They searched the entire structure but found nothing. No source for the sound. No explanation for its origin. Another group reported seeing lights flickering in windows on the top floor, even though the power had been disconnected years earlier. When they investigated, they found the rooms empty and dark, with no sign of anyone having been there. The most disturbing incident occurred in 1983, when a young soldier named Rajan was assigned to guard the building overnight. He was stationed in the main lobby, tasked with ensuring no one entered the premises without authorization. For the first few hours, everything was quiet, but around 2 a.m, Rajan heard footsteps coming from the floor above him. He assumed it was another soldier and called out, but there was no response. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving along the corridor directly above his position. Rajan grabbed his flashlight and climbed the stairs, his heart pounding. When he reached the second floor, the footsteps stopped. The hallway was empty, lit only by the pale glow of the moon through the broken windows. Rajan swept his flashlight across the space, checking every doorway, every corner, but there was no one there. Then he heard it, a voice, barely a whisper, speaking in Japanese. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable. It was pleading, desperate, as if begging for something. Rajan backed away, his flashlight beam shaking, and as he did, he saw a shadow move across the wall at the far end of the hallway. It was the shape of a man, tall and thin, with arms that hung unnaturally long at its sides. The shadow didn't move like a reflection of light. It moved on its own, gliding along the wall toward him. Rajan ran, not stopping until he was outside the building, and he refused to go back inside. His superiors reprimanded him for abandoning his post, but they reassigned him to a different location after hearing his account. By the time the building was finally abandoned in the late 1990s, its reputation was firmly established. Old Changi Hospital had become synonymous with hauntings, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead seemed thinner than anywhere else in Singapore. Urban explorers began visiting the site almost immediately, drawn by the stories and the challenge of spending time in such a notorious location. Some came with cameras and recording equipment, hoping to document the paranormal activity. Others came simply for the thrill, to prove they were brave enough to walk the same halls where so many had suffered and died. Most found nothing more than an old, decaying building, but a significant number left with experiences they couldn't explain. A group of university students visited the hospital in 2003, armed with digital cameras and a video recorder. They explored the ground floor without incident, filming the graffiti-covered walls and the debris that littered the rooms. But when they ventured to the second floor, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and the natural light from the windows seemed dim, even though it was midday. One of the students, a young man named Wei, noticed that his camera's battery was draining rapidly, despite being fully charged when they arrived. He switched to a backup battery, but it too drained within minutes. The group decided to move to the third floor, where the former interrogation rooms were located, and that's when things escalated. As they entered the corridor, they heard a sound like metal scraping against concrete, coming from one of the rooms ahead. They approached cautiously, pushing open the door to reveal an empty space, the walls cracked and stained, the floor covered in dust. But the scraping sound continued, louder now, and they realized it was coming from behind them. They turned and saw nothing, just the empty hallway they had just walked through. Then the temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath became visible, and they heard a voice, low and guttural, speaking in Japanese. The words were angry, each syllable dripping with menace. Wei raised his video camera to record, but the device shut off completely, the screen going black. The others fumbled for their phones, but those too had died, their batteries inexplicably drained. The voice grew louder, and they felt a pressure in the air, as if something was pressing down on them, making it hard to breathe. One of the students, a young woman named May, began to cry, saying she felt like someone was standing right behind her, their breath on her neck. The group fled, stumbling down the stairs and out into the daylight, and none of them ever returned. Paranormal investigation teams have visited Old Changi Hospital multiple times over the years, and many have reported significant activity. One team, equipped with EMF detectors and thermal cameras, recorded a sharp drop in temperature in the former interrogation room, a decrease of over 15 degrees in less than a minute. Their EMF detectors spiked repeatedly, indicating the presence of electromagnetic fields that had no natural source. When they reviewed their thermal footage later, they found an anomaly, a cold spot in the shape of a human figure moving across the room even though no one was standing there. Another team captured an EVP, an electronic voice phenomenon, on their audio recorder. The recording was of a man's voice, speaking in Japanese, and when they had it translated, the words were chilling. He was saying over and over that he couldn't leave, that he was still there, that he was waiting for someone to come back for him. The team also reported feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness in the basement, where the morgue had been located. Several members described feeling nauseated and disoriented, and one investigator said she saw a fleeting image of a woman in a nurse's uniform standing in the corner, her face pale and her eyes hollow. When she blinked, the woman was gone. The team concluded that the building was indeed haunted, that the spirits of those who had died there during the war had never left, trapped by the trauma they had endured. The most notorious area of Old Changi Hospital is the third floor, specifically the room that locals refer to as the interrogation room. This is where the Japanese military police conducted some of their most brutal sessions, and it's where the paranormal activity is said to be strongest. Visitors who enter the room often report an immediate sense of dread, a feeling that they are not welcome, that they are intruding on something dark and malevolent. Some have described hearing voices, not just whispers but full conversations, as if multiple people are in the room with them, even though they are alone. Others have felt physical sensations, cold hands touching their shoulders, fingers brushing against their skin, as if the spirits are trying to make contact. One urban explorer, a man named Daniel, visited the interrogation room in 2010 with a group of friends. They had heard the stories and wanted to see if they were true. As soon as Daniel stepped into the room, he felt a wave of cold wash over him, so intense it made him shiver. He pulled out his camera to take a photo, but as he raised it, he felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if someone had punched him. He stumbled back, gasping for air, and his friends rushed to his side. When they lifted his shirt to check if he was injured, they found red marks on his skin, 4 parallel lines, as if someone had raked their fingers across his chest. There was no explanation for the marks, no physical cause, but they were real and they were fresh. Daniel refused to stay in the room, and the group left the hospital immediately. The marks faded over the next few days, but Daniel never forgot the experience, the feeling of being touched by something that wasn't there, something that wanted to hurt him. Old Changi Hospital remains a destination for those who seek the paranormal, but it also stands as a grim reminder of the horrors of war and the suffering that took place within its walls. The building is deteriorating, its structure unsafe, and there are ongoing discussions about whether it should be demolished or preserved as a historical site. But those who have experienced its hauntings believe that demolition won't end the activity, that the spirits trapped there are bound not to the building itself, but to the land it stands on, to the memories of what happened there. They believe that even if the structure is torn down, the echoes of the past will remain, that the voices will still be heard, the shadows will still be seen, and the cold spots will still appear on the hill where old Changi once stood. The hospital is a place where the dead refuse to rest, where the past is always present, and where the line between this world and the next has been irrevocably blurred. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The horrors of war leave scars that never truly fade, and old Changi is proof of that. But not all hauntings are born from violence on such a grand scale. Some are more intimate, rooted in rituals meant to protect, but that instead unleashed something far darker. In the mountains outside Tokyo, there exists a place that even the bravest investigators hesitate to approach. A mansion where an ancient ceremony went horribly wrong, and where the consequences of that failure still manifest in ways that defy rational explanation. What happened there is not just a ghost story. It's a warning about the dangers of tampering with forces beyond human understanding. There are places in Japan that exist only in whispers, locations so steeped in tragedy and supernatural dread that even mentioning them is considered bad luck. Himuro Mansion is one such place. Officially, records of the mansion are scarce, almost deliberately obscured, as if someone wanted to erase it from history. But the stories persist, passed down through generations, each retelling adding new details, new horrors. Urban explorers who claim to have found the ruins speak of a crumbling structure hidden deep in the woods, accessible only by overgrown trails that seem to shift and change, leading visitors in circles. Some say the mansion doesn't want to be found, that it reveals itself only to those it chooses, drawing them in with a curiosity they can't resist. And those who do find it often leave with more than just photographs and memories. They leave with a sense of wrongness, a feeling that they've crossed a threshold they were never meant to cross, and that something from the other side has followed them home. The Himuro family were practitioners of an ancient Shinto ritual known as the strangling ritual, a ceremony designed to seal away malevolent spirits and prevent them from escaping into the world. The ritual was complex and required precise execution, involving a chosen maiden who would be bound and strangled with sacred ropes, her death serving as a lock on the spiritual gate. The family believed that by performing this ritual, they could protect their land and their bloodline from the influence of dark forces. For generations, the ceremony was carried out without incident, the chosen maidens accepting their fate as a necessary sacrifice. But in the late 19th century, something went wrong. The maiden selected for the ritual, a young woman named Kiri, fell in love with a man from outside the family. Her feelings compromised the purity required for the ceremony, and on the night of the ritual, she fled. Her escape threw the family into chaos, because without the maiden, the gate could not be sealed, and the spirits the ritual was meant to contain began to break free. The family patriarch, consumed by rage and desperation, took matters into his own hands. He hunted down Kiri and brought her back to the mansion, but by then, it was too late. The ritual had been broken, the gate was open, and the malevolent forces had already begun to seep into the world. In a fit of madness, the patriarch slaughtered his entire family, believing that their deaths might somehow appease the spirits and close the gate. But it didn't work. The gate remained open, and the spirits, along with the tormented souls of the murdered family, became trapped within the mansion's walls, unable to move on, unable to find peace. The first documented accounts of the mansion's haunting emerged in the early 1900s, when a group of villagers stumbled upon the property while searching for a missing child. They found the mansion in ruins, its walls blackened by fire, its interior filled with a stench so foul it made them gag. But what disturbed them most were the sounds. Even from outside, they could hear weeping, a woman's voice crying out in anguish, echoing through the empty halls. The villagers refused to enter, convinced that the place was cursed, and they left without finding the child. The missing child was never seen again, and locals began to avoid the area entirely, warning their children to stay away from the woods where the mansion stood. Over the decades, the stories grew. Hunters who ventured too close reported seeing lights flickering in the mansion's windows, even though the structure had no electricity and had been abandoned for years. They described hearing footsteps on the floors above them, the sound of doors slamming shut, and voices speaking in hushed, frantic tones. Some claimed to have seen figures moving through the trees near the mansion, pale shapes that seemed to glide rather than walk, always moving toward the building, as if drawn by some invisible force. One hunter, a man named Takeshi, spent a night near the mansion in the 1930s, sheltering from a storm. He said he heard a woman screaming from inside the building, her voice so filled with terror that it made his blood run cold. He left his shelter to investigate, but as he approached the mansion, the screaming stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. He stood at the entrance, his lantern casting long shadows across the rotting wood, and he felt an overwhelming urge to leave, a primal instinct warning him that he was not safe. He turned to go, but as he did, he heard footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, as if someone was following. He ran, not stopping until he was miles away, and he never returned to those woods again. In the 1950s, a group of university students decided to investigate the mansion, hoping to document its history and debunk the supernatural claims. They brought cameras, notebooks, and camping equipment, planning to spend several days exploring the site. The first day was uneventful. They photographed the mansion's exterior, noting the extensive damage and the way the structure seemed to lean precariously, as if it might collapse at any moment. But when they ventured inside, the atmosphere changed. The air was thick and oppressive, making it difficult to breathe, and the temperature was noticeably colder than outside, despite the summer heat. The students explored the ground floor, finding remnants of furniture and personal belongings, all covered in a thick layer of dust and decay. In one room, they found a collection of old photographs, images of the Himuro family dressed in traditional clothing, their faces solemn and unsmiling. One student, a young woman named Yuki, noticed that in several of the photographs there was a figure standing in the background, a blurred shape that didn't seem to belong. She pointed it out to her companions, and they agreed it was strange, but they dismissed it as a flaw in the old film. That night, as they set up camp outside the mansion, they heard the sounds begin. At first, it was just a faint rustling, as if something was moving through the trees, but it grew louder, more insistent. Then came the weeping, a woman's voice, broken and despairing, coming from somewhere inside the mansion. The students looked at each other, unsure whether to investigate or leave. Yuki, driven by curiosity, grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the entrance. The others, reluctantly following. Inside, the weeping was louder, echoing off the walls, and it seemed to be coming from the upper floors. They climbed the stairs, the wood creaking under their weight, and followed the sound to a room at the end of the hallway. The door was closed, and when Yuki reached for the handle, she felt a shock of cold run through her hand, as if she had touched ice. She pulled the door open, and the weeping stopped instantly. The room was empty, save for a length of rope hanging from the ceiling, swaying gently despite the absence of wind. The students stared at the rope, their flashlights illuminating the frayed fibers, and then they saw it. On the floor beneath the rope, there was a dark stain, shaped like a human figure, as if someone had lain there and bled out. The stain was wet, glistening in the light, even though the room had been abandoned for decades. One of the students reached down to touch it, but Yuki grabbed his arm, pulling him back. She had a feeling, a certainty, that touching the stain would be a mistake, that it would invite something they didn't want to invite. The group left the room, their nerves frayed, and they decided to abandon the investigation. As they descended the stairs, they heard footsteps above them, following, and the sound of the rope swaying, creaking back and forth, back and forth. They didn't stop to look back. They left the mansion and never returned. The legend of Himuro Mansion spread further in the 1980s, when a paranormal investigation team from Tokyo visited the site. They were equipped with the latest technology, infrared cameras, EMF detectors, and audio recording equipment, and they were confident they could either prove or debunk the haunting. The team spent 3 days at the mansion, documenting everything they encountered. On the first day, they recorded several anomalies, cold spots that appeared and disappeared without explanation, and electromagnetic fields that spiked in areas where there was no electrical equipment. On the second day, they captured audio recordings of voices, some in Japanese, others in an older dialect they couldn't identify. The voices were fragmented, phrases that didn't make sense on their own, but that conveyed a sense of desperation and fear. On the third day, the team ventured into the basement, a part of the mansion that had been sealed off for years. The air down there was even colder, and the smell of decay was overpowering. They found remnants of the ritual chamber, a small room with symbols carved into the walls, and in the center, a stone altar stained with something dark. One of the investigators, a man named Hiroshi, set up a camera to film the altar, and as he did, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned, expecting to see one of his teammates, but there was no one there. The sensation lingered, a weight pressing down on him, and then he heard a whisper, directly in his ear, a woman's voice saying a single word in Japanese, "Run." Hiroshi didn't hesitate. He grabbed the camera and fled the basement, his teammates following. When they reviewed the footage later, they saw something that made their blood run cold. On the film, just before Hiroshi felt the hand on his shoulder, a figure appeared behind him, a woman in a white kimono, her face obscured by long black hair. She reached out toward him, her fingers inches from his shoulder, and then the footage cut to static. The team published their findings, but they refused to return to the mansion, stating that the site was too dangerous, that whatever was trapped there was not at rest, and was actively hostile to intruders. The most disturbing aspect of Himura Mansion is the recurring phenomenon of the gate. According to the legend, the mansion's entrance, the physical gate that leads onto the property, is said to bleed on the anniversary of the failed ritual. Several people claim to have witnessed this, describing a thick red substance that seeps from the wood, dripping onto the ground below. The substance doesn't dry or evaporate. It simply vanishes after a few hours, leaving no trace. A photographer named Kenji visited the mansion on the supposed anniversary in 2005, determined to capture the phenomenon on film. He arrived at dusk, setting up his equipment near the gate, and he waited. As midnight approached, he noticed a change. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the forest, the insects, and night birds fell silent. Then he saw it. A dark stain began to spread across the gate's surface, starting at the top and slowly trickling downward. Kenji raised his camera and began taking photos, his hands shaking. The substance was thick and viscous, and in the dim light, it looked exactly like blood. He reached out to touch it, but as his fingers drew close, he felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something had struck him. He stumbled back, gasping, and when he looked down, he saw red marks on his skin, similar to scratches, but deeper, as if made by nails. The bleeding gate continued for several minutes, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The substance vanished, leaving the wood clean and dry. Kenji packed up his equipment and left, his photos showing the phenomenon clearly, but he never returned. He said the experience left him with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake, a feeling that he had witnessed something he was never meant to see. Himuro Mansion remains one of Japan's most infamous haunted locations, though its exact whereabouts are a subject of debate. Some believe the mansion no longer exists, that it was destroyed or reclaimed by the forest years ago. Others insist it's still there, hidden, waiting for the next person foolish enough to seek it out. The stories continue to circulate, each one adding to the mansion's dark legacy, and paranormal enthusiasts from around the world still attempt to find it, drawn by the promise of encountering something truly supernatural. But those who have been there, who have walked its halls, and felt the weight of its history, know that Himuro Mansion is not just a haunted house. It's a wound in the fabric of reality, a place where the veil between the living and the dead has been torn, and where the consequences of that tear continue to manifest in ways that defy understanding. The spirits trapped there are not passive. They are active, angry, and they do not want visitors. They want release, and they will use anyone who enters the mansion to try to achieve it. The strangling ritual was meant to seal away evil, but in its failure, it unleashed something far worse, and that evil has never been contained. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.